I'll save oh, there we go. I'll save the platitudes about that for another time, but suffice it to say, I appreciate everything you're doing on behalf of your organizations and on behalf of our region as a whole. Thanks for your hard work this year. And I know it's far from over. We got 16 days in the calendar year. My name is Ben Underwood. I'm serving as president of AFPWNC this year and very honored to be doing so. Thanks for joining us today. Lovely to see as many of you as are here. If you're able to turn on your camera, I know I and our presenters always appreciate that, but do what allows you to participate. I want to thank our sponsors, and then I'll introduce you to Kim and Olivia, who are giving us a talk today on donor stewardship. So the work of AFPWNC is underwritten by some generous sponsors this year who really allow us to function as a chapter and offer the sessions that we do. Those sponsors this year are UNC Asheville, who's the title sponsor, Western Carolina University, the Community Foundation of Western North Carolina, AB Tech, the Community Foundation of Henderson County, and First Citizens Bank. So thanks to each of those entities for their investment in the professionalization of fundraising in Western North Carolina. With that, I'd like to give a brief introduction to our speakers today. I'm very happy to have Kim Hinkelman and Olivia Palmer here. The title of their presentation is Stewardship Through the Donor Lifecycle. Stewardship is an incredibly important topic, one that it seems like every time I talk to somebody, they feel like they need to be doing more around stewardship. They need to learn more. So this is a very salient topic for us. Kim Hinkelman has been a trusted leader and resource development advocate for more than 40 years. She applies her leadership experience to nonprofits across the country through her consulting work. Professionally, she's served at the executive level at health systems, hospital foundations, nonprofit agencies. And she's also a teacher, an instructor in nonprofit management programs at WNC Nonprofit Pathways and Western Carolina. She's also active with Flat Rock Playhouse. You'll learn more about that today in Henderson County. She's on the board of the Blue Ridge Literacy Council, and she's a member of the Athena Committee with the Chamber of Commerce in Henderson County. And Kim is well known to this group, but I'm happy to offer her that introduction. And she is co-presenting today with Olivia Palmer, who's a resource development professional at the Flat Rock Playhouse. And it's worth noting, Flat Rock is the state theater of North Carolina, which is an honor, certainly an honor to be designated as such. Olivia began her fundraising career in 2018 at the Playhouse. She was the box office manager before that, and she came up through the Playhouse as a teaching artist and arts education administrator. She's local to Hendersonville, and she actually first became connected to the Playhouse as a student in the arts education program. So that's a really, really nice story. She's thrilled to play the role that she does at Flat Rock, particularly working with volunteers, supporting the board, grant writing, and doing annual fund stewardship. So with that, I will turn it over to Kim and Olivia for their presentation. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks, Ben. I'm going to pull up a few slides. Okay, let me, oops. So what I wanted to do to just start with is, first of all, say I'd rather this be more of a conversation than a presentation, because I think one of the best things about AFP is that we learn from each other all the time. So you can unmute yourself, you can raise your hand, you can put stuff in chat, however you would like to engage. I'm old and I can't watch chat and screens and my thoughts all at the same time. So if you have just interrupt me, just put your hand up or say, Kim, wait a minute. And that would be perfectly fine with me.
And so, I'll volunteer to keep an eye on the chat for you too, in case anybody pipes up there.
Awesome. That's great. Thanks, Ben. So I would agree with Ben that stewardship is one of those areas where it's a word we hear all the time in development. It's something we talk about. It's something we think about. And it's something that we set aside when other things have to happen, because there's always pressing needs. So our program today, me and the slides are not on the best of terms. this is what I said about the program. Donor stewardship is all about relationships. Starts with a gift, continues on throughout the lifetime of that donor and beyond. So today we're going to talk about developing a plan for that, why it's important to do it, what does it accomplish, and we're going to kind of close our time, and Olivia is going to spend some time talking about how do we connect with online donors, those folks. That's a growing group of people, and how do we cultivate them in relationships? So just a quick question for all of you. What are there any things that you come into this hour thinking, oh gosh, I really hope that they talk about this, or I hope she mentions this? Is there anything you want to throw out there so we make sure we talk about that or cover that? Okay, well, that's good, because that means,
I have
Oh.
something.
sure.
Sorry, it's slow to unmute. I would be interested to know if you have some information about what's coming. What are some of the newer trends or ways that some of the best practices around enhancing stewardship that we may not be the tried and true that we've been as familiar with?
Okay. And I think maybe that's something Olivia can touch on at the end as we get into that segment, but that's a great question. Anything else? Thanks, Elizabeth.
Always curious, Kim, for advice about how to keep stewardship in the forefront when there's so much pressure to bring gifts in the door, and not always an institutional understanding of the importance of really taking care of the relationship.
Okay, great question. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but thank you, Ben.
I know one of my biggest struggles is trying to find some kind of reasonable balance between plans that really are attuned to donors' preferences and needs, and not therefore having 3,000 donor plans that I can never follow up on.
Okay, that's important and valid for sure. I don't know that I have any magic answers to that, but we can talk about it. Anything else? Okay, very, very good questions. I like to start with definitions so that we're kind of all on the same page about what we're talking about. And so when we talk about stewardship, or the word steward, here's a couple of things that pop up. First one, a steward is a person who looks after passengers on a ship, aircraft, train. The steward brings them meals. We've moved to being flight attendants, but they used to be called stewardesses, obviously, on the planes. But they're the people who took care of passengers. Another definition or another example is a person who's employed to manage another's property, especially a large house or an estate. I personally would like to have a steward in my life to take care of my property and my messy house. But again, it's that definition of a person to manage something or take care of something. And then the last one is a definition of stewardship: the job of supervising or taking care of something, such as an organization or a property. So an example, a responsible stewardship of our public lands. When I came into development, before that, I was employed by the church, and the word stewardship in the church world, to me, always meant, oh, it's that time of year when we ask people to make pledges or tithe or talk about their offerings. So it did have a connection to money, certainly. But in this case, stewardship is about taking care of, managing our donors, those people who give us gifts, give the organization gifts. But it also refers to having some kind of system or a method in place. So it's not just caring about those people and having a relationship with those people, but it's really about creating a system or some kind of method for yourself to practice good stewardship of those donors. Does that make sense? So the next thing we talk about is why is this even important? Isn't it more important? And some of you touched on this when you were talking a little bit about how do you balance? Our job is to raise money. This time of year, a lot of pressure to meet your goal. You know, a couple of you have already said that. You're looking at the calendar going, geez, I got 2 weeks left and I still have to raise this much money. Olivia and I knew that we had this big goal of $1.5 million at the Playhouse in the last week, kind of looking at where are those dollars coming from, where are those gifts coming from, how much more do we have to bring in to meet our goal. So why is it important to even think about stewardship then, right? It's more important to get the gifts in the door. But here are some thoughts I have about that. One is it improves your donor retention rate. You know, when you look at metrics and we start to talk about statistics and metrics around fundraising, one of them is, are you retaining your donors? So I don't know if lie bunt and side bunt is still a big phrase out there in the development world, but when I was coming up 30 years ago, learning fundraising lingo, you know, we looked at that lie bunt last year, but unfortunately not this year. They gave last year, they didn't give this year. Do we just say, oh, well, let's go find somebody else to give this year? Or do we kind of look at that and say, why did that person quit giving? Sometimes it's legitimate. They're deceased, they moved, you know, whatever. But good stewardship practices absolutely improves your donor retention rate. Second thing is good stewardship practices encourage donors to give more. If you practice all the principles of stewardship, donors will give more money. They'll increase their annual gifts. They'll figure out a way to continue their annual giving, but maybe give to a special program, or they step up. And I learned this from working with Alex on a capital campaign. You know, you do a capital campaign, and then if you have a good stewardship program in place, those people who gave a gift to the capital campaign can continue to give and give and give after that campaign's over, if you have a good stewardship practice in place. You begin to build a meaningful community because you're building a group of people who consistently give, and they begin to connect with one another if you build a good stewardship program. And it's cost effective. The statistics all say it's more expensive to attain a new donor than it is to retain a current donor. And so when you're drilling down and you're really looking at your budget and the money you're spending on direct mail, or you know, whatever your budget includes in your fundraising program, it's much more cost effective to retain your donors. And having a good program in place to do that through stewardship is the best cost-effective measure there is. I pulled up some statistics from a customer insight group, and a couple of the things that were impressive to me. In 2020, donor retention hit a low of 43.6%. That means that for every 1,000 donors a nonprofit had, 564 donors did not donate in 2020. That's a huge loss of donors. And so that's an alarming statistic to think about, that the donor retention rate is beginning to travel southward. The 2020 new donor retention was 19.2%. That means that less than 1 in 5 donors who gave for the first time in 2019 didn't give again. That's also alarming to me. Recurring donors gave an average of 42% more than one-time donors. So again, if you think about your cost effectiveness, those people who have given and then give again, give more than your one-time donors. So those are just some quick little bullets of why it's important to be talking about this. I can't get this to click. There we go. So here are the kind of the stages of donor stewardship. I need to keep an eye on my time because Olivia is going to kill me if I don't give her time to talk. Okay, so donor stewardship starts with the gift acceptance, right? You have to think about that. It starts at the very beginning, and a donor's experience is beginning with, how do you welcome them as a new donor? What's their experience with you when they give that first gift? I will tell you a very quick story of something that just happened to a donor and a board member at the Flat Rock Playhouse. He wanted to make a significant gift, he and his wife, to another organization. They've been longtime donors, but you know, they've averaged about $1,000 a year as annual donors. They wanted to make a one-time gift of $50,000 to this organization. He called me, which I find a little odd that he called me to tell me about this, because I wanted to say, well, why aren't you doing that for the Playhouse? That's beside the point. And said, I'm curious, what do you think about this? He said, I called the organization, left a message for the CEO to call me, and the CEO knows these people. And he did not call me. He had the development assistant call to say, hey, what's up? And this person told them that he and his wife would like to make this significant gift. And it was designated for a particular purpose that existed, that he wasn't making something new up. It was a purpose that would be helpful to the organization. And this person said to him, well, I don't really know about that. I'll have to get back to you. A week goes by, nobody calls him back. And finally, he called the development assistant again and said, you know, I really want to make this happen before the end of the year because it needed to come out of his, you know, charitable funds. I really would like to talk to the CEO. And long story short, the CEO never called him through this whole, he called like 3 times, called this organization and wanted to work this out. He kept talking to this assistant who said, well, you know, we'd have to put half of that in the unrestricted fund to help cover our expenses. And so only half of that then could be counted towards this restricted fund that he was talking about, which is when he called me and said, does that sound right to you? And I said, no, none of this sounds right to me. Well, he called me the other day and said, I just wanted you to know that we withdrew our offer and we're not going to do that. He said, in fact, we probably won't ever give to that organization again. And it breaks my heart because I love the organization. And what I said to him was, I am so sorry you had that experience. That is beyond my understanding of how you could bungle something, right? But again, that's that gift acceptance piece. Are you making those donors feel really good about what they're trying to do and what their motivation is to give? Are you beginning to understand that? We need to make it as simple as possible for people, don't we? The second step of donor stewardship is the acknowledgement. Do you have a process in place to acknowledge that gift immediately? Now, however you define that, I've always liked to define that by using the 24-hour rule. That's not always practical. It depends on the organization. The bigger organizations have a bigger machine and method in place to do that. But how are you acknowledging that gift? How are you making that person feel welcome to your organization? And there's lots of ways to do that. You know, is it a letter? a note in the mail? Is it a phone call? How have you established that acknowledgement process? The third piece of a good stewardship program is recognition. And so how do we handle recognizing our donors? Is it an annual report? Are there giving societies? Do you have a publication that you can lift up donors and tell their stories? How do you handle anonymity? Do you have a very careful process in place so that that person who says, I want to be anonymous, you don't mess that up and by mistake put their name in an annual report and then they go away because they're upset? I had a conversation yesterday with somebody who got angry about something that happened years ago, and it's going to be really hard to woo him back because a lot of damage was done at the time. And, you know, here we are 4 or 5 years later, still talking about it. So that recognition piece is important. Do you host donor events throughout the year where different levels of donors can be honored and acknowledged that way? I'm not giving you any answers. I'm just kind of throwing pieces out there for you to think about because every organization is very different. The next one is communicating results. And this is where that, you know, at the beginning when I said stewardship is really a process and a methodology. And so circling back to our donors and communicating with them, what's happened? What did their gift help make happen? How's the organization doing? Are we sending them updates about what's happening at the organization? Social media is great. Blogs are great. But we have to keep in mind, not everybody is on social media. So we're kind of still living in this time of social media is fabulous and it's inexpensive and cost effective, but we still have donors who are older folks. They're not using social media. They don't have email. I know that's hard for some of you to understand that or acknowledge that, but they don't. People aren't always using email. So we're still having to do both of those things, aren't we, in our world? We're having to do hard copy stuff and use social media stuff.
Can I ask a quick question, Kim? I'm sorry.
Sure. No, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, as I'm looking at this list about when you include asks within your stewardship plan. So what I mean by that is I sent out a special newsletter report is what I called it to folks who gave over a certain level this year. And I didn't include an ask, but I did receive gifts after that happened. So I was just wondering if you could speak to a little bit of best practice around that.
Well, I think it depends on the world you're in. I think universities, and you know, Ben, you can speak to this, Alex, you can speak to this. Universities are very good about that. Every time they send any kind of communication, there's an opportunity to give. They never miss an opportunity to give. I think smaller nonprofits are a little bit more reticent about doing that because you don't want to ask too many times. I don't know what the best practice is. I think you have to kind of fill that out for yourself. But I'm not shy about asking, because I think if you're communicating with your donors regularly, it sounds like that's what you did, sending out a communication, they read it, they were inspired by it, and they gave another gift. And so I don't think there's anything wrong ever with putting a vehicle for somebody to give again in your communications. You know, an annual report, you tuck an envelope in there so that there's that vehicle for them to give. You send out something, a newsletter, a communication. We, at the Playhouse during the pandemic, we started a weekly electronic newsletter that went out just to stay in touch with people, because the Playhouse wasn't producing anything. And so our way of connecting with donors and patrons was always through the theater. Well, that was closed. And so we sent out and in every one, there was a link for people to make a gift, just to keep that in front of them. I personally don't think, and Alex, you can speak to this too. I don't think people get offended if you ask again. They can choose to give or not give.
I'm gonna, if I can jump in just a second,
Yeah.
Kim, I have struggled with this my whole career, and I've had enough people object by saying, Comfort, the only time I hear from you is when you want money. And I like the recent term, Kim, this is a terrific presentation. The communicating results. I like the new term, to me anyway, of impact report. Telling the donor exactly what's been done with their money. And when I send an impact report, I don't ask for more money. It's just my thing. But you're right. The universities, by and large, will always do that. Annual reports, it's always a question. Do you stick an envelope in there? Most people do it.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, it takes one $5,000 check, and it was a good idea.
Right.
But you know, this is great stuff.
So, Carrie Ann, I don't think that answered your question in terms of a best practice. I think you just have to, you have to, well, we'll move to this next thing because it's really putting the plan together. So I think we'll answer that for you. But this last stage of donor stewardship is the cultivation or the engagement stage. And that's
Kim,
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. Mark is said in the chat, he's got a story about stewardship related to donor lists, which you mentioned a few minutes ago, that he's willing to share if that fits in.
Great. Well, let me finish this thought and then
Sure.
we'll tee Mark up. But my thought is gone now. It doesn't
That's
take
my
much.
fault, Kim. You were talking about
that's
cultivating
okay.
and engaging
Yeah.
after communicating results.
But this is the place where you're really deepening a relationship with these people. And I'm not, when we talk about this, we need to do some segmenting of your lists too, because you can't possibly engage in deeper relationships with 10,000 people. You've got to figure out who those people are that you need to circle around and visit with. It's an emphasis on relationship building, not on solicitation. So that, Carrie, and that's probably circles back to your question, is this cultivation engagement piece is, when do you call Mrs. So-and-so and say, hey, I'd like to stop by and tell you about how that building's going. You're not going to ask for money. You're just going to give her an update and to, chat with her. It's about the relationship. And always, 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 it's about building a relationship with the organization, not with you. I feel very strongly about that, because I think where we make, in our profession, when we leave to go to another job, that organization should not miss a beat or lose donors because of that. Because if you've done your job well, you've connected them to the organization over and over and over again. And so, yes, they may miss you because they like you and they have a relationship with you, but the more important relationship is with the organization, and that you're constantly engaging them in knowing the story, getting the insider story on what's happening in the organization, asking them to be ambassadors so you can continue to cultivate them and engage them in more meaningful ways and deeper ways, not necessarily always asking for money at that point. Okay, so I'll stop. Mark, why don't you pop in with your story, and thank you for that.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Kim. This is really great. I just, one thought that I thought I'd share is, even before these stages, there's an organization I have in mind that I've given to in the past, but I haven't given to them in a while because I keep getting mail addressed to a person who doesn't live in my house. And that person is my ex-wife that we divorced like 15 years ago. and it's upsetting to my current wife. And I have called, and these mistakes happen. And, and I realize they probably bought this list, and it's a terribly outdated list for her to still be listed as, living here. It's irritating, but I understand that happens. But I've now called this agency over the last 3 years about 4 or 5 times and left messages pleading with them, please just take her off of this list. She's not here. I don't want to get mail from her here. And I haven't gotten any kind of response. I got another letter the other day from this agency. And so it's, it's kind of top of mind for me. And so it's just to say, that you want the lines of communication to be clear with your organization, and you want your phone lines and such to be set up in such a way that if there is something that people want to reach out about, might be somebody who's got a relatively minor irritation like mine, or it could be someone who wants to give you a big check, but if the messages aren't getting through, then, you feel pretty invisible, and you're not very likely to give to that organization again. So that's
Right.
my 2 cents.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, that's like that story I shared about the guy at the Playhouse and his annoyance with not following up. And it doesn't make any sense because everything's computerized. It's so easy to go in and change a record, for heaven's sakes. It doesn't make any sense that they can't fix something like that. I'm sorry you're having that issue. Okay. All right, here, we're going to get into the meat of this, and I'm happy to share these slides because I'm going to zip through these pretty quickly. But building a stewardship plan. And so I think it's helpful. And one of you said, how do we keep stewardship in the forefront of our work? I think one thing you can do is form a stewardship team. Maybe a couple of board members, staff person, whatever, that's the piece that they focus on. And I think whenever you kind of broaden the responsibility and bring other people into that, they own it. I like using board members for things like that because it's then as a board member, they bring it back to the board. So I saw somebody in chat say, my board's worried that if we ask too many times, it becomes white noise or it starts to bother people. But, a board's responsibility for a nonprofit is to help raise money, and good stewardship is part of that piece. So I would challenge you to think about that. Is there a way to engage, put a little team together that really focuses on this piece? And that might help. The next piece is segmenting your donors into categories or levels. Not all things are equal here when we talk about stewardship. And so we're going to look at a matrix in a minute, but how could you categorize your donors in ways that make sense, so that you have different plans for different people? My rule when I was at the hospital was everybody got a hard copy thank you letter that went out the door within 48 hours. I would say 24, and they would negotiate with me and go, can we make it 48? But then there was a list of donors who would get a phone call. There were other donors who would occasionally get a note or a phone call from the CEO of the hospital. It just, because it was all kind of categorized, and we figured that out.
May I ask a question about that?
Yep.
And I apologize for not being on camera. I'm really sorry. I've got a lot going on in my house today, but this is an issue that I get a little bit confused about. And I also have been in development for quite a while. And I remember that when I was getting trained initially, around the millennium, actually. There was this idea that you shouldn't base your stewardship too much on gift amount, because really, what does it mean? First of all, a donor might be giving at their capacity if they give you $100. And so kind of like on an ethical basis, why wouldn't you give them the full treatment or some really good treatment, because it might be the biggest gift that they could give.
Mhm.
Second of all, more strategically, you can't really tell anything about a donor's capacity or interest in your organization or affinity just because they've given you $100 or $50. Some donors are very conservative upfront and could make a much larger gift. They also might be emphasizing plan giving in their thinking and not planning to make big gifts to anybody, but planning to make big estate gifts. So like, I've seen situations where organizations just send a printed postcard to people who give up to $200 or something. And I feel like that's kind of a tragedy, because you just don't have the information about that person to sort of like keep the stewardship small like that. But I recognize also there's a practicality issue. So could you talk about some of those competing ideas?
Sure. I think there's lots of ways to segment donors. I don't think it has to be by financial definition at all. What if your segmentation was first-time donors, people who give monthly? Is there a different way to communicate with them? Planned giving donors who are also annual donors. I mean, I think there's different ways to think about it. You could also segment your list by communication preferences. Do you know them well enough, or could you do a survey and say, would you like to hear from us via email, or would you rather a phone call? Could you segment your people that way so that you've got a list of, here's this group of people that get a monthly email from you. Here's a list of people who get a quarterly hard copy newsletter from you. So it doesn't always, and I would not disagree with you that you're making big assumptions about people based on that gift, that number that's on that check. That's not necessarily fair to them, nor to you, because you're making some big assumptions. So I think there's other ways. Could you segment by demographics? Could you segment by what people are supporting? So you've got people who support the education program. You've got people who are donors who just give unrestricted dollars to support the operations of the organization, and you have a different plan for them. Does that help?
Yes, and thank you for clarifying that you're not talking about segmenting based on gift size. I didn't really assume that you were, but I just appreciate the clarification.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate the question, because I think we do have a tendency to do that. Yay, when a $10,000 check comes in, ding, ding, ding. And when a $100 check comes in, we go, well, that's really nice. And so we do it ourselves. I mean, we do react that way to things. Partly because we're all dealing with a budget, and that's a number, right? That's a number we have to hit. And so those bigger financial gifts move the needle a little bit more. But when we're talking about stewardship and donors, you are absolutely right that person who wrote a $100 check, that could have been a huge number for her, and she dug deep, and she didn't do a couple of other things so that she had that money to give at the end of the year. So I think it's important. That's a very important thing to think about. But somehow segmenting your donors so that you're thinking about them differently is important to do. Then a plan would include engagement opportunities. We talked a little bit about that. A plan would include your recognition plan. And now that you've got some kind of categories or segments of your people, How do you recognize them? And are there different ways to recognize different groups of people? Create a stewardship matrix. I'm gonna show you that in a minute. And the last thing is evaluate your plan and get feedback. And it's not a bad idea every couple of years to do a survey of your donors to see how you're doing. Do they feel appreciated? Do they like the way you're doing recognition? Do they feel like you're communicating with them? Do they know what's going on? And so I think from time to time, and that in itself, a survey like that is an engagement strategy to keep people connected, right? So this, I don't know how well you can see this, but I think on your own screens, you maybe could zoom in. This is just an example of a stewardship metrics. And so you see across the top, my categories are new donors, loyal donors, which would be a definition of longevity, not financial amounts, but longevity, however you want to define that. Have they been donors for more than 5 years or, 10 years or whatever? Major donors, however you define that number, and planned giving donors. Okay, so those would be my categories. Then down the left, these are those 4 areas we talked about. The first area would be the gift itself. So we're going to assume the gift is in. And now we've got acknowledgement, recognition, reporting, and ongoing engagement. Those 4 categories I talked about. And so the next thing is the communication type, because we talked about how important it is to communicate, report, connect. And so each one of those categories, you think about acknowledgement, your new donors, how do you not acknowledge a brand new donor? And on this, it says it's a thank you email or a phone call within 24 hours. I don't know, is that reasonable for you or not reasonable? You need to figure that out. And so you see examples all the way down. A thank you call from the ED, a welcome letter to a first donor, a new donor in the first week, an annual donor lunch invite to your loyal donors, major donors, planned giving people. And then the recognition category, there's an annual report listing, a legacy society luncheon. Do you do a highlight in your newsletter about a donor, a video update of the impact? Those are just some examples of things you might think about doing. Reporting back to them, an impact report, an update on the gift, their gift use. Is there a volunteer opportunity for them? A survey, I put that in there. And then ongoing engagement. So holiday cards, a summary at the end of the year for their taxes. If you send out, every time they make a gift, if you send them a letter, do they save all those letters for their taxes? Or do you do something at the end of the year? Gala invitation, donor anniversary. So those are all, when you talk about building a stewardship plan, a process, a method, this is what I think gets to it. This keeps you organized. This is a plan that you put in place. You become very thoughtful about each one of those categories and how you're going to do those things with them. How do you acknowledge their gift? And maybe that's the easiest thing to start with. What are you doing right now? When that first time donor makes a gift, what are you doing to make them feel special and welcomed? Your loyal donors. And then once you have this plan, I think, at the beginning, one of you mentioned, how do you create a reasonable balance between the donor needs, this stewardship, and the need to raise money? Well, you need to begin to think about this as also raising money, because these are all opportunities to get a second gift and a third gift and a larger gift and a planned gift. And so I think to kind of shift your mindset away from, I've got to raise money, but I'm also supposed to be doing good stewardship and taking care of my current donors. Well, this is all part of raising money. And I think if you could start thinking about it that way, it doesn't seem like a just an extra onerous thing that you have to do when you're really when you really are on the mat for raising dollars. Does that make sense to think about it that way?
Tim, I just want to be mindful of time. We've got about 11 minutes left. We may lose some people at 12:30.
Okay. I'm going to skip over this, but I'm going to send this slide out. I feel very strongly that one of the things you need to do is think about your different generations of people. And I've got this other really cool document that I will send to Ben and have him send to all of you that kind of goes through each generation and has fundraising tips for each one of those groups, because it's different how they like to be communicated with, what's important to them. But I'm not going to talk about that. Same thing with personality types. People are motivated for all kinds of reasons. And the more you get to know who those people are, the more successful you're going to be at cultivating them. So skip. And now it's Olivia. And she's going to talk a bit more about online donors and these first, this is kind of a new trend. And so I think this is really important to talk about. So,
great, yeah. So I'm going to jump right on in. So I've kind of laid out some information here, really looking at the pillars of success, understanding both the audience that you're trying to reach through online donor stewardship, as well as the online landscape that you're looking at. So what can be really challenging about this is stewardship, I think in this capacity, it starts a lot earlier. And we'll kind of go through this as we talk particularly about the technology. So with this, we want to be able to capture as much information from possible from a first-time donor, from an online source, so that we can continue this process of communication and personalization, appreciation, all of that we've kind of been talking about thus far. So really kind of looking specifically at the audience, if we're thinking about this millennial group, a bit younger, that 18 to about 34, or no, I guess 20, 21 to in their 30s at this point is that millennial group. If you look at, for instance, Giving Tuesday, it's estimated that 82% of participants were in that age group. So it certainly is a significant group for us to be paying attention to. And often your online presence is going to be your first encounter with them to bring them into the organization. So that's where we kind of want to start thinking about stewardship from the very beginning of how we set up the way that we capture the information, the way that we draw them in. So as we go through the process, we can immediately communicate with them in the way that they'd like to be communicated with and the information that they want to receive. Another thing we do know about millennial and younger donors in general is there's a fair amount of organization testing. So they are known to, give smaller gifts to a variety of organizations and then make adjustments accordingly, depending on how invited into that organization they feel, or truly the impact that they see from the gift that they make. So kind of jumping through here into those pillars, we start out with having the right technology to do that. It's important to have a strong online presence. I think we've all seen the importance of having a mobile-friendly website. So many people use their phones primarily. And we also want to make sure that it's not only easy to find our information, that information is up to date, because that certainly builds trust right off the bat with that potential donor, thinking if they don't know much about you, you want that information to be so easily accessible. And the more current and the more what's happening right now that information is, the more trust you're going to build right off the bat. We also want an interface that is easy to use. So you want to make sure, however you have that giving set up, whether that's a donate button on a variety of pages or the actual giving form, we want that to be click through, pretty easy. Millennials and younger donors are also particularly interested in monthly giving. So having a way that they can set that up, and they can choose the start date, the end date, how much they want to give a month, is a great way to draw them in and find out what kind of giving lifestyle they potentially could have with your organization. And through that form, we want to be able to collect as much information as possible, but also not having it take a lot for the donor itself. So knowing what post exactly did they click off of, what email did they respond to, and using that to build essentially their profile of that plan that you'll use to follow up with communication. So what technology do you need to have that up-to-date profile and to collect the correct information and make giving super easy? Content is going to be pretty important after that. In order to get their attention, we need to have strong storytelling elements. It's estimated that, you know, in 2021, people are exposed on a daily basis to 6,000 to 10,000 advertisements a day, and that is a lot of noise to cut through. So how do you find that particular success story that really draws them in and motivates them to move? And can you showcase to them right off the bat what they can expect as far as that donor stewardship? Do they see you responding to other people and sharing, you know, donor appreciation on your social media profiles? It gives them kind of a sneak peek into what they can expect. So from there into meaningful communication, hopefully at this point, we've been able to connect with them on a particular, and I think about the Playhouse particular education program, you know, if they gave specifically to that, how can we follow up with more information about that program specifically? That kind of gets back to the segmentation we've been talking about a bit. And I love that we also talked about impact reports. That is a big deal as you go forward in the communication level with your donors there. Of that impact report can be anything from, you know, a full realized report to maybe even just, you know, I think at the Playhouse of students at the end of a class sending a video to those donors who've supported the program and all the kids are waving, you know, something like that is really has the potential to touch their hearts. So with that meaningful communication, there are some you know, good aspects to look at, particularly from email communication and videos. Videos certainly get a high level of you know, viewing rates, and it connects you to the organization more in a way where, particularly the last few years, we haven't been able to connect face-to-face with people. Video really has opened up that opportunity. And there are some really great apps out there that make that possible. Texting also has come up as a really great way to connect with donors. And that is so that's important to try and capture that. If they gave mobily and you know they were on their phone, can you set the communication preferences so that you can text them? And there are some really great programs out there for that as well. Google Voice and Textology are, you know, they've got various levels, but they're really great to just send that immediate thank you to people. And then finally, looking at benefits, we want those to just be invitational. How can we then draw the person closer? In the last year, we of course have seen a lot of rise in virtual events, and while we certainly will, you know, shift back into a combination of those two, how can you bring that online connection into a virtual event and, you know, potentially build that into getting them on site and visiting with you? So thinking about ways to get started, the biggest thing is going to be authenticity and execution. You know, reviewing what your technology is, what kind of stories you have to tell, and how can you do that efficiently, and double checking that you're telling the stories you want to tell to those specific people. So certainly drawing on that donor segmentation. So I wanted to go through that kind of quickly and mostly open this up to if people have had successes or challenges and questions about this stewardship program for online donors. Thinking, you know, we just had Giving Tuesday recently, of any information people would love to share at this point on that, or challenges that have come up.
I have a quick question. It's probably really not a smart question, but being a little bit old school, I have this preoccupation with at what point should I try to get a physical address for somebody, or is that just an obsolete concern?
I think that's a great question. And that certainly becomes part of the communication process. You know, if someone gives to you online, there certainly is evidence to support that transitioning to more traditional, you know, sending a letter and getting that physical address. Some people want to be communicated that way. But we are seeing growing trends, particularly with younger donors who, you know, say Giving Tuesday was their first time giving, or giving through a Facebook fundraiser or something like that, of it being email, even sometimes through social media and their social media profiles, or texting really has started to come up as well. So looking at, you know, what you have the capability to do, and email has really been, you know, effective sort of medium at the Flat Rock Playhouse of being able to capture, you know, a larger group as people who respond to email. That group is also opening up as well. So there's certainly some options, and I think it using that communication preference is a great donor segmentation. So certainly sometimes looking for that physical address is helpful.
I just want to chime in. It is 12:30, and I know that some people will have to go, and I want to be respectful of that. But if there are further questions, I'm certainly happy to hang out for another moment or two if Kim and Olivia are able to continue the conversation just a few more minutes. But wanted to thank everybody for attending today, and thank you, Kim and Olivia. This was a really helpful presentation and a great refresher or orientation to good stewardship practices for all of us. So thank you. And I hope to see you all in 2022. We'll have a program in January, the third Wednesday, and more information about that to come.